As a reptile content creator, I get a ton of questions, whether it's comments on videos, comments on my Instagram posts, or private messages. So I thought I'd give you all the opportunity to ask away and ask your burning reptile questions, and I will go through and answer as many as I possibly can. If you are new here, then hi, I'm Ellie from Ellie's Exotics, and I've been keeping reptiles for about 10 years now, and before that I was a fish keeper too, so I've got a lot of experience with exotic animals, and I also have a lot of friends and connections within the community to always keep my advice and care updated. I used to work as an exotic animal educator as well in schools and care homes, nurseries, telling people all about these amazing animals, and I have qualifications in herpetology and animal care and behavior. I ended up getting a lot more questions than I thought I would, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to answer all of them today, but if you'd like to see another one of these videos, then make sure you leave your questions in the comments of this video for a possibility of being featured next time. But anyway, that's enough about me. Let's get right into these questions. I've got them all wrote down here, and I'll try and answer them as best as I can. One of the most popular questions that I got was regarding bonding. So this question in particular is the best way to bond with a juvenile crested gecko. I also had people ask about juvenile corn snakes and juvenile ball pythons, but as babies, whether you have a snake, lizard, gecko, just take your time, be very patient. Other than just going in and picking them up, you can sit by the enclosure, you can leave the door open and talk to them. I honestly think one of the reasons why my animals are quite chill with me is because I'm always in here talking. They know my voice and they know that sounds aren't a threat. So the next question says, hi Ellie, for a snake, how often should you clean the terrarium for a non-bioactive terrarium? That is, how often you should completely replace the substrate and clean all the decor. I also wonder if you have any good tips on how to best sanitize or clean cork logs. So when it comes to cleaning out naturalistic enclosures or enclosures that are not bioactive, it does depend on what substrate you are using. So I really recommend using a topsoil and play sand mix or a pre-mixed substrate that's similar to that. And I do a deep clean every 3 to 6 months, depending on the species. If the animal is producing huge poops, like if you've got a boa or a Burmese python, then you might need to clean out the substrate more regularly because it will get dirtier faster. If you've got something like a little corn snake, then every 3 to 6 months is the sort of standard that I go for. Now that doesn't mean not cleaning at all for 6 months straight. Every week you'll be going in and spot cleaning, picking up any urates, any poops that you see, and then replenishing the topsoil that you take out. To sanitize the enclosure, I like to use Safe 4, but to sanitize things like cork and other types of wood, you can put them in the oven or the freezer. The next question says, hello Ellie, I love reptiles, they're my whole world. My question for you is, what was the hardest reptile for you to keep? Or what reptile do you think is the most difficult in general? Now, maybe this is a hot take. I don't think any reptile is necessarily hard to care for. Some can be more challenging, you know, like if you've got a huge Asian water monitor, obviously that's going to be a lot more challenging than a corn snake. But I think the challenges in reptile keeping isn't necessarily about how hard something is. It's more how much maintenance that animal needs, the space that they take up, the type of food that they eat, etc. So for me, if we're talking about my most high maintenance animal, that probably would be my pink-tongued skink, because she eats multiple times a week. She eats snails, which aren't necessarily very easy to get, and she also will only eat from tongs. She won't go and find the food herself, so she's a high-maintenance girly. If we're talking reptiles that I don't currently have, I think an animal that would be hard for most people to keep are your massive species, like your anacondas, your Burmese pythons, your reticulated pythons, your savannah monitors, Asian water monitors, you know, things like that. The enclosures are not very accessible to people, especially here in the UK. Like, most of us do not have space for an enclosure that is properly sized for them. These animals will typically take up like a whole room in your house. For me, that's not the vibe I'm going for. The next question says, so I'm gonna upgrade my corn snake from his baby enclosure to a 4x2x2. And the only way I could fit the heat lamp was inside the enclosure. It's hooked up to a dimming thermostat and has a guard on it and a ceramic dome. Do you think this would be safe for him, or is he at risk of getting burns? So in the UK, it's actually really common to have your heat lamps inside of the enclosure. And that's because most of our enclosures are made of wood, so they don't have a mesh top. Instead, they use other ways to ventilate the enclosure. If you go in my reptile room, almost all of my heat lamps are inside of the enclosure, except for the ones on this top row here. And they do sell specific heat guards for inside of the enclosure. Now, I think when you say the ceramic heat dome with the guard, typically those are still used on the outside. So for something like a tortoise where they're hanging over an enclosure, for a lamp on the inside, you want to use a ceramic bulb fitting that's drilled into the enclosure, and then you can drill a cage around it. It's completely safe and it is quite common. You just have to make sure that your animal can't get through the holes of the guards. The next question is staying on the topic of heating, and that is what wattage heat lamps for each size enclosure. Now, this is a very difficult question to answer because wattage depends on a multitude of factors. So things like what your climate is and what species you're working with. There's no one size fits all when it comes to wattage and enclosure size. Sometimes you might have to mess around with the wattage, like with my corn snake enclosure, because she's now stacked between two vivs. I've taken her from an 100 watt to a 75 watt, and then eventually now she's on a 50 watt. You just have to ensure that the lamp isn't constantly dimming, and if it is, then your wattage is too high. The next question is about feeding. I currently feed him small mice, and I'm wondering when I should upgrade to medium mice. Should I use the 10 to 15% of body weight or what? This is a great question, and I think there's an even easier way to gauge your feeder size for your animal, and that is by just using your eyes and going off of the prey size and the width of the snake's body. Your feeder should be roughly 1 to 2 times the width of your snake. They should have a bit of a lump after they eat their food, and if they don't, then it's too small. The next question is one that I get quite a lot, and they are asking, where do you find credible sources when you have limited information? I've got a lot of species now that are pretty much impossible to research, and a lot of the care guides are actually made by myself, like with Woma pythons. So in that case, just look at where these animals come from, have a look at their habitat, have a look at their size, and then use the information that you already have about reptiles and apply that to the animal. The next question is a very interesting one, and when I saw this come up, I knew I had to include it in the video, and it's about hamster wheels and their benefit towards reptiles. They mention this in the comment, and they say like the main issues that people have with wheels and hamsters is that it can curve their spine into an unnatural position and it can damage their spine. Do I think that we should be putting them in all our enclosures? No. However, I have used hamster wheels in cockroach enclosures, and a lot of other people have as well, and there is evidence that they will go and use the wheel. Now, I know cockroaches are very different from reptiles, but it's interesting. If you are going to try it, then try and find as big of a wheel as possible, like this comment says, so that their spines aren't curved. Something to consider with these animals as well, they're not going to be like sprinting on them like a hamster. So there is, I guess, less risk of injury there. I'm not going to give it like the seal of approval. I don't want to be like the be all end all here when it comes to this specific question, because I don't want any animals to get injured on my behalf because I said it was okay. But it's something to think about, and you know, within a supervised environment, maybe give it a go. The next question says, tips and tricks to help a leopard gecko eat. Our Leo has been with us for a couple weeks and he's still refusing to eat. We didn't handle him right away, and he does explore his home regularly. I get this question quite a lot, and it's really hard to answer because there are many factors as to why your animal might not be eating. When you first bring them home, it is really normal. It can take a few months for them to settle in. But if they're not eating due to new enclosure stress, then typically you won't see signs like these. So things like losing weight. If they are rapidly losing weight, or if they are taking any meals at all, they're regurgitating them. If they're lethargic, then it's time to go to a vet. But like I said, this question is really hard to answer when I haven't seen the animal in person. So my advice is just to keep trying, try different feeder insects, try with calcium and without calcium, because I know you want to try and get the calcium in them, but sometimes they don't like the taste at first. Try just chucking the bugs in the enclosure and leaving them in there overnight. Try tongue feeding, hand feeding, just try every single type of feeding that you can think of, and eventually they will take their food. Just don't handle your animal until then. And then the last YouTube question that I'm going to answer before we move on to the Instagram questions is, do you know of any exotic animal expos or exhibitions around the West Midlands or otherwise around the UK? So there's only one expo that I know of and that I attend, and that is IHS. Now IHS has moved around over the last few years, but currently the expo is being held in Blackpool. So when this video will be coming out, on Friday the 7th of August, there is actually an expo in 2 days. So it's on the 9th of August and I will be going. So if you see me there, then come and say hello. I promise I don't bite. And IHS is typically twice a year. It used to be 4 times a year, but now it's twice. So usually July and August. I recommend following them on Facebook just to see where the show is going to be held and look out for any updates, because unfortunately there are people actively trying to get these shows cancelled, and they've got the complete wrong idea when it comes to the IHS Expo. But now let's move on to the Instagram comments. If you don't already follow me on Instagram, it's Ellie's Exotics with a double S. I'll pop it on the screen, and I use Instagram so much, a bit too much to be honest with you. I post shorts and I post updates of my animals, and I am always posting on my story. So give it a follow if you want to see more regular content on there. So the first question says, do snakes need their rodents dusting with supplements like geckos do with bugs? Now this is something that I actually have done. I used to do this and I didn't see any difference. I think I did it for probably about 6 months to a year, and I didn't do it with all my animals because I was trying to do comparisons. At the time I had 2 corn snakes, and I had one of them, Kiki, with shed support dusted, which is like a calcium and multivitamin mix by Arcadia, and then Calcifer, who did not have his rodents dusted. I thought I was seeing differences at the time, but now that I've stopped dusting her mice, I don't think there's really any difference there. But obviously I don't know what's going on internally. There is no visible difference, but there might be a difference going on inside of their body. The next question is also about feeders, and they said, how do you keep your feeder insects healthy, alive, and gut fed? I get my bugs weekly, which helps with keeping them alive because they aren't around for very long. So typically what I'll do is I'll pop them into like a little faunarium that I have, and I'll leave the bug mix that they come with in there, and I'll give them some fresh veg. I have Omnigold for my pink tongue skink, and she usually doesn't eat it. So if I've got any leftover Omnigold in the fridge, then I'll give that to my bugs as well. But I always make sure that there's like a bit of cucumber or something with high water quality in it so that they stay hydrated, because that's usually when they will die, is when they're dehydrated. So make sure they have some sort of access to water. The next question says, does a female leopard gecko have to lay eggs at some point, or only when they're breeding? This is a great question because it's something that not a lot of people talk about. If you have a female reptile in general, not even just a leopard gecko, they may lay eggs at some point. I have had infertile eggs from my chameleon gecko, my crested gecko, my gargoyle gecko, and you can even get infertile eggs from your corn snakes and your royal pythons. If they're a female, even if they've never been with a male, there is a chance that they can lay eggs, because if they're producing eggs, then they can become egg bound, which can be a bit stressful. So that's why I have a lot of boys at the moment. But if you do get eggs from any of your reptiles and they've not been paired with another animal, they are most likely infertile. What I recommend doing is popping them into the freezer for 24 to 48 hours and then discarding of them. My camera died. Anyway, the next question is, can you have a terrarium that is too big for a crested gecko? My answer to this is yes and no. I think people's main concerns with New Caledonian geckos is because they eat that powder formula that they'll struggle to find their food. If I've got a 4-gram gecko, then typically I will put it into a smaller enclosure. Cheese was only 10 grams when he went into his 18 by 18 by 36 enclosure, and he had no problem finding his food. So my answer to this is, it depends. It depends on the gecko. just monitor them and keep a close eye on them. You might want to provide multiple food dishes to make sure they are getting the food that they need. And I think the main issue with putting a tiny baby into a big enclosure is that they can escape. Bigger enclosures typically have bigger ventilation holes, so make sure your pet isn't getting out of those holes. The next question is, where is the best place to put the humidity probe inside of the VIP? This is a great question because depending on where you place it, you'll get a different reading. And that's why people suggest having a humidity gauge on either side of the enclosure, because obviously it's going to be less humid where your heat lamp is. So have one on the warm side and one on the cool side. And then the last two questions, I'm not going to necessarily answer, but it's something that I wanted to bring up, and absolutely no hate towards these people. I don't mean this in a horrible way, but I get a lot of DMs specifically about sick animals. And I just want to preface, I am not a vet. If you do message me asking about health problems, then usually you won't like the answer because it will be me telling you to go to a vet. I have rehabbed animals. I have rescued animals. I do know what sick animals look like. But if that animal is not there in front of me, in my hands, there is really not much I can do to help you. Because if I don't have the full picture, like their enclosure, if I don't know their background, where you got them from, it's really hard to advise you. Like I said, I'm not a vet. I can't prescribe any medication so your animal gets better. So if you ever have a health problem with your animal, please do not message content creators. Go to a vet. But anyway, that is the end of this video. If you have any more questions, like I said, leave them down in the comments and I'll try and answer them as best as I can in the next video. As always, let me know what your pets are called, and if you'd like to get some labels for their enclosures like you might have seen in this video, you can get them from my Etsy store, which will be linked in the pinned comment. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and I will see you all later. Bye bye.